Well, good morning. This is a little different. I'm used to sitting over there interpreting. I'm excited to be here with you. I remember when I first began my walk with Christ, dive into Scripture and try to digest as much Scripture as possible. I remember reading such amazing stories of like Moses as he parted the Red Sea, David who fought off Goliath, or even in the New Testament, the apostles that took the cause of Christ and sacrificially went on to spread the gospel. One of those apostles I remember reading quite often was Peter. Peter stood out to me quite a bit. It's such wonderful moments like Luke 5, 8 through 11. When Jesus called Peter to follow him, Peter's told, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." Or Matthew 16 through 20. Jesus is asking his disciples, "What do they say about me?" And in perfect step, Peter responds, "You are the Messiah, the Son of God." Or maybe even one of my favorite, Matthew 17, when Peter gets to stand on the mountaintop before Jesus and see him transfigured, his clothes turn to a glowing white, and his face shining like the sun. What a marvelous sight that would have been to be Peter. You see, today I'd like to share with you 4 different stories that hopefully will make Peter a little bit more relatable. I've had a hard time connecting with him, but these stories seem to humanize him. Hopefully, as we take a closer look into who he is through these 4 stories, maybe you'll be able to identify with something that Peter is going through. And just maybe, you'll see Jesus' redemptive work in Peter and the parallel he does in our life. So let's go ahead and start. If you would like to follow along, it's going to be in Luke 22. We'll be in the first story. It's from Luke 22, 7 through 34. The disciples are in the upper room. They're sitting around. They had just shared the meal that is commonly called the Last Supper. Tensions are high, as Jesus states, verse 15. He says, "And he said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." Clearly predicting what's going to become of him in short time. While most think that Jesus should be prepping to overthrow the Romans and strategizing, it's not the case. Instead, he takes bread, takes fruit of the vine, and he institutes what we now hold as communion. In fact, some of the apostles begin to argue and dispute over which of them is the greatest. And as that dispute closes, Peter, with a zealous, maybe awkward feeling, jumps in. In verse 33, he says, "Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death," showing his willingness to follow. Only to be told by Jesus, "I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times." Did you notice Peter's identity there? His carelessness, his willingness to interject himself, demonstrating his lack of consideration for Jesus' statement of what was before Jesus. In fact, one of the things that Jesus says to Peter, "Satan has asked to sift you." And Peter's interjection almost overriding and not recognizing the significance of what Jesus just described. Well, I'd like to think most of our hastily managed moments in life have come only in our 20s. I'm only more certain that as I get older, I realize how many more hastily moments I have, similar to Peter. Perhaps you can identify with those moments in your life. Maybe due to a dispute with a coworker, maybe just driving down the street and the frustration you might feel towards the driver. Or maybe in the midst of a financial decision that comes with great pressure, both for you and your family. Or maybe you've been hasty when you've received good, wise, sound advice to only cast it to the side and let it be trampled. Nonetheless, Jesus responds to Peter, albeit bleak, with a slight side of redemption. He said in verse 32, "But I have prayed for you. I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." Our second story is in Luke 22 also, verse 47 through 52. The disciples are in the garden this time. And Judas has led the high priest as well as his guards right to Jesus. The disciples, fearing their Messiah was going to be taken away, responded with this, "Lord, should we strike with our swords?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. We learn from John 18:10 through 12, it was Peter who reacted by cutting off the servant's ear. Did you see the identity? Maybe you have felt that sense of losing control. Or, maybe slightly on the other side, a sense of ego in certain situations. The sharp words of someone who criticizes your faith, wanting to snap back. The bitterness. When those you care about, even with good advice, let their life spiral out of control. Or maybe on a deeper note, when we think back a little bit further, before you gave your life to Christ, when you so bitterly grasped at straws, trying to find meaning for your life, only to leave a trail of brokenness along the way. I love the perspective Jesus has in Matthew 26, recounting the same story. It's in Matthew 26, 47 through 56. He states, "Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way?" Gotta love Jesus' perspective. You see, in this moment, Peter's just cut off somebody's ear. And maybe even worse, maybe he even intended to kill them. Which would leave him in a position where he's committed a crime. And if that's the case, the guards being there are probably more justified arresting Peter in that moment than Jesus. But yet there's a major act of redemption that takes place. And maybe Peter didn't notice it. Maybe if you and I were in the same situation, we would overlook it. But Peter in that moment is a beneficiary of Jesus reaching down and restoring that servant's ear. And again, maybe Peter doesn't recognize the implications in that moment, but he's redeemed. He's not held at fault for what he had done, at least not legally. Perhaps you might identify with Peter in his lack of understanding of how significant this act might have been. It might take you down an uncomfortable path as you think back to your past. God has been gracious at different times, and he's redeemed us of certain situations, saving us by not having to go down and experience certain situations in hopes that one day we would be sitting here glorifying him, serving him. Yet on the other hand, there are moments that we weren't so fortunate like Peter to escape. There were moments where we had to live through the consequences of whatever the situation was. And that redemption for us didn't come in that moment. Our third story is from Luke as well. It's in verse 55 through 60. Jesus has been taken into the home of the high priest. And Peter, in all of his bravery, maybe a little hastily, decides to follow at a distance. He obviously isn't right with Jesus. Otherwise, he too would be persecuted and go through what Jesus went through. But he's also not with the other apostles, who at this moment are not present. He sits down next to a fire. He's questioned twice as to his knowledge of Jesus and his commitment to Jesus. And twice, he denies Jesus. According to John 18, 26 through 27, where this story is also found, the third time is a little bit more unique in John's account. In fact, it reads, "One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him, 'Didn't I see you with him in the garden?' And yet again, Peter denied it." As we continue reading in Luke, Peter's confronted with the trail of brokenness due to his lack of control. In fact, when he lashed out and attacked the servant, even though Jesus had redeemed him, he was still burdened by the stain of the action. He was being judged for his actions while he was living redeemed. Can you identify with Peter in this moment? As you think back to your past, are there moments that you still live by the stains of what was once redeemed? Possibly, maybe, it could be a family dispute, or a family member doesn't want to let go despite your pleading, or a coworker who insists you ate their lunch, when in reality, you didn't. More intricately in Luke 22, verse 61, the Lord turns, it reads, "The Lord turns and looks straight at Peter. Then Peter, remembering the word of the Lord, had spoken to him, 'Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times.'" What an uncomfortable position it must have been in to disown him 3 times and then have Jesus, in the process of being persecuted, questioned, looked over at Peter. And I know on one hand, it's a shameful feeling that Peter's probably feeling, because he's just done the unthinkable. He's just denied Jesus for a 3rd time. Yet there's a second part to that prophecy that Jesus spoke to Peter. And it reads, "But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." Last, I'd like to share another story from John 21. If you'd like to flip over, more than welcome. Give you a little paraphrase. It's a little lengthy. You see, the disciples at this point are pretty defeated. In fact, Peter and several other disciples have returned home to return to fishing. That's what they knew. That's what was comfortable. All they knew was their Messiah was gone. What else was there to do? And it's hard not reading John 21 and reading about them going back to fishing without getting some sense of dissatisfaction with the way things are. In fact, in verse 4, it reads, "Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not recognize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, 'Friends, haven't you any fish?' 'No,' they answered. Mind you, these are skilled fishermen who have done this day after day, year after year, except for the past 2 years. The past 2 years, they've walked with Jesus. They've communed with Jesus. Jesus poured everything into their lives, prepping them for the service that they would carry on. How difficult it would have been to return to that mundane way of life after all that they had gone through. Have you ever felt that disconnect the disciples are feeling in this moment? That feeling of you have some knowledge of something, and it just doesn't feel right to go back. I know before I was a Christian, it felt great, but life felt pretty pointless. Life felt pretty pointless. I lived to serve my own cravings. I bought what I wanted. I cared not for anyone else, but whatever I needed or wanted, I pursued. I was constantly exhausted, and never did I have enough money to satisfy the want, the chase, the experience, or even the person. I love this section of Peter because John identifies in verse 7 that it's that it's Jesus. And Peter's response is like how I would wish to respond. It reads, "Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, 'It is the Lord.' As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, 'It is the Lord,' he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and he jumped into the water." You have to love his impetuousness. He's willing to be close to Jesus. That desire that once again, Jesus is back, and he's alive, and he wants nothing more to be close to him, to be back in his presence. And so Peter takes his garment, wraps it around his waist, jumps in the water, and swims to shore. Now he is making the full effort to be near Jesus, regardless of the cost. A little later on in this passage, Jesus invites the disciples, after bringing in their catch, to come sit down to a fire and a meal already prepared for them. And this is when it gets real for Peter. in John 21, verse 15 through 19. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hand, and someone else will dress and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." What an intimate setting this is. Jesus around a fire with a few disciples. Peter's given the opportunity to undo the sin that he did by affirming his love for Jesus 3 times. And twice, Jesus' response, 3 times, Jesus' response is, "Feed my sheep, take care of them." The weight of this interaction doesn't come in the question. Rather, the response, it is begging Peter to take action upon. Feed my sheep. Take care of my sheep. He is given something to do, not just his love, but also through this redemption, he's experienced Christ. To pour into others, to be concerned for the things that they're concerned for, to be entrusted with the responsibilities of co-managing those who are in God's kingdom. No longer to see the world through the lens that he once did, with expectations of a Messiah and an earthly rule. Rather, to be given a new perspective. You see, Peter was fully redeemed. And he wasn't ready until that final moment. Feed my sheep. Maybe you've identified with one of the short stories. Maybe you're the Christian who has walked with God for a long period of time, or maybe a short period of time. Maybe you've walked with God, and in some respects, this might be a reminder of the redemptive work God has done in your life. And as you continue to serve in your ministry, share the gospel with those around you, to meet the needs of others, maybe this is just a keep it up. Or maybe you feel pulled. Maybe you have 5 children and you feel pulled. Maybe you operate a business. Whatever your struggle is in life that has pulled you away, maybe this is a call to come back. Like Peter, we stand face to face with Jesus, and he asks us, "Do you love me?" And in that question, may we confess, "Yes, Lord." If that is the confession of our heart, may the action that comes from it be feed my sheep. Show the love of Christ to someone. Serve those in the church or outside of the church. Whoever is in need, see fit to meet their needs. Or At the very least, use the gifts that God has given you to bring him honor and to build up his people. In any case, God is not done with you. You are still a vital part of his kingdom. And you are still the intended way for him to reach others. Maybe you're that person who's towing the line of putting your faith in God, wondering if this is for you. Like Peter, we might be impulsive. We might be quick to react. Maybe at times we feel like life is losing control all around. And maybe through that process, it's led us down a road of poor choices, leaving a trail of brokenness behind us. The answer isn't solely in trying to change yourself. There's plenty of self-help books out there to do that. Rather, allowing God's redemptive work to cover us in our lives, to conform to the desires he has for us. You see, in submission to God's will, Peter went on to be used to do great things within the kingdom. And he saw the church grow as the gospel spread. So, if you're ready to talk to somebody about what that walk looks like, I would encourage you. Sure, we have deacons and elders. I see a lot of fit people out there who are willing to meet with you and talk with you. And maybe your heart's stirred and you're ready for baptism. Whatever age you might find yourself, whatever place of life, you too can make like Peter and jump into the water. And on the other side, you'll meet Jesus. And there you will be able to commune with him. Thank you.